Cubase 10 now supports recording, importing, exporting, and converting audio files with bit depths of 32-bit integer as well as 64-bit floating point. So a higher bit depth means higher resolution audio. To change your bit depth within Cubase, go up to Project and go down to Project Setup or press Shift S. Down here, you can change your sample rate, your bit depth, and your record file type. Between the sample rate and the bit depth, these control the overall quality of your audio recordings. So the sample rate is the number of samples taken per second during the analog to digital conversion process, and the bit depth is the number of bits of information created per sample, so essentially the word length of each of the sample points. Ultimately, the bit depth controls the dynamic range of an audio recording. So this dynamic range is essentially the signal to noise ratio between the peak value of the waveform and the noise floor. So the peak value is where the signal is at 0 dBFS, and the noise floor is where you can hear audible noise. So with 16-bit recordings, you have 96 decibels between peak level and noise. With 24-bit recordings, you have 144 decibels. And with 32-bit integer, you have 192 decibels. Now, the difference between integer values like 16, 24, and 32-bit and floating point values like 32-bit float and 64-bit float is that with floating point bit depths, the noise floor will rise and fall as the signal rises and falls. So 32-bit float will have a wider dynamic range than 24-bit, but not wider than 32-bit integer. Likewise, 64-bit float will have a wider dynamic range than 32-bit integer, but not higher than 64-bit integer, which isn't even an option here. However, if there was a 64-bit integer option, it would have a dynamic range of 385 decibels. Now, all technical talk aside, from an audible standpoint, hearing audible noise is not really an issue even with 16-bit resolutions, unless you're really over-compressing, over-limiting, or doing some other processing that might pull up the noise floor to an audible level. Other than Cubase 10, there aren't many DAWs that support 32-bit integer and 64-bit float recording, and typically I've always shied away from using the floating point bit depths anyway, because they increase your file size with really no audible difference in quality unless you improperly set your levels and accidentally clip, and you need to normalize the signal down to the peak level. So I've always used a 24-bit integer value, and I've skipped 32-bit float altogether. But now that 32-bit integer is an option, I may be using that as my new standard for recording in Cubase.